We're recording, so I shouldn't really say anything else.
Oh yeah, hell. Hello and welcome to the Hackaday Podcast. I'm Elliot Williams.
And I'm Al Williams.
This is episode 317, Quantum Diamonds, Citizen Science, and Cobol to AI. This week in Hackaday News, we opened up our first contest of 2025, the Pet Hacks Contest. And this is for anyone who has any sort of hacks related to their pets. Head on over to Hackaday.io, open up a project, enter it in the contest, and you stand a chance of winning a $150 gift certificate from our contest sponsor, DigiKey.
Well, pets are certainly man's best friend, I think, right? So
I went looking for, previous examples of similar hacks that we should suggest to people, and I must have found 150 pet hacks. Well, I mean, Hackaday's put out a lot of hacks, but still, it's a lot of them. And so I picked a good bunch and threw them in this post for you. Even if you don't want to enter, you should just read it just to see them all together. It's pretty fun.
Well, I want the AI harness that knows where your dog is and then actually gives your dog a voice. I always make dogs talk anyway, so if I could have the AI do it for me, that would be even more fun. I'm curious, I don't know if you picked it or not, but how about all the hacks we've had for people like radar tracking dog poop? Does that count as a pet hack, or does it have to be attached?
It does. We have actually an OpenCV-based drone picking up dog poop project, which I think is the most ridiculous of them all.
Certainly get the neighbors talking.
But a lot of them are, totally sensible. Finding lost pets, letting pets in and out by themselves. I'm surprised by the number of chicken coop hacks we have, but I guess it makes sense because, they need to come home to roost and you need to keep the foxes out.
I think we've seen some reptile habitat hacks too, haven't we?
Probably. Oh man, I don't think I put any in the short list, but I'm sure we did. I definitely put some. Yeah. Actually, in my short list, I only even put in one aquarium hack. Boo me. It's fun because, a lot of them are centered around making things easier. Like, did you remember to feed the cat? Or, things like that. But then some of them are about playing with the pets. I think of the ones I found here, absolutely most heartwarming was a guy who put a beeper into his dog's favorite fetch toy when that dog went blind. And so he could still play fetch with the dog, right? But, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I thought that was a sweet gesture.
I'm liking this title, Python Keeps a Gecko Happy, Terrarium Automation with Raspberry Pi.
Nice. Anyway, if you have a pet-related hack, head on over to I.O., open up a page, and we'll see what we get. I think there are going to be tons and tons in this one, and it'll be really fun. I like your idea of a pet translator.
Well, and it's a good excuse to at least enjoy some people's pet pictures, which you don't need much of an excuse to do that, right? So,
contest runs for 6 weeks until May 27th. So if you're going to get on in, get on in. We'll be writing up some of the entries as they come in over the next few weeks too. So stay tuned. If you like pet hacks.
This is a journey into sound.
What's that sound?
What's that sound?
This week is a guest-submitted sound. I actually downloaded it. I'm not 100% sure what it is. I'll have a listen.
Okay. Wow. Well, I think that's a German house band practicing in a wind tunnel. That's my guess. I haven't seen the video, so you tell me. Am I close? I don't know.
I have seen the video, and that is not it. I'll give you one hint, maybe, and then we can offline try to figure out what the heck is going on here. This was a video sent in by Space Ben.
That's different.
See?
Maybe they're and the hammering is the...
I think that's actually quite possible. That may be possible enough that we might have to cut this out. Yeah. I'm not sure yet. But again, like I said, I don't know what it is. So, yeah, we'll see. If you know what it is, head on over to hackaday.com/podcast. You'll find the show notes. Scroll on down to What's That Sound? Click there. Give us your handle, your best guess, and we'll pick among the right answers next week. And somebody will be in the running for a Hackaday Podcast T-shirt.
Yes, please tell us what it is because we don't know either. So,
all right, this first hack is a science hack, and it comes from Mark C. and his colleagues at Quantum Village. The article we wrote is called Shine On You Crazy Diamond Quantum Magnetic Sensor, which I think is one of the best titles of the week as well. Thanks, Dan Maloney, for that. But that's what it is. It's a quantum mechanics-based magnetic sensor that depends on a synthetic diamond, and in particular, a synthetic diamond with intentionally produced nitrogen impurities in it. And the reason you want to have these nitrogen vacancies in the diamond lattice is that if you hit them with a laser, you can excite the extra electron that it's got into a higher spin state, and then it decays back down. This turns into a magnetic sensor because the decay back down depends on what energy state the electron spin ends up in, and that can be influenced by external magnetic fields. You hit it with the laser, it decays back down, you look at it with a light detector. Depending on which of the different bands it's in, different energy states it's in, it either radiates a red photon or it doesn't. And so then there's this one more complication here, which is to put it in a particular energy state, you have to nudge it a little bit more. And so it uses a microwave to give it that extra little kick. And so what they're doing is they're charging it up so that it jumps up to its big first energy level and then nudging it between one of two higher energy levels with this microwave by sweeping the microwave across it with a different frequency. And then which of these two bands it ends up in depends on the external magnetic field. They sweep the frequency of the microwave extra kick up and watch for the dips in the returned light, the fluorescent light, when it hits. And these dips get further apart from each other depending on how much external magnetic field there is. And that's because it took more of the microwave energy to pop it up to an extra energy state. Whew, too much quantum mechanics here. You should absolutely go read the papers if you are interested in that. We've actually got a great explainer video of how this effect can be used for making quantum qubits in another article we've written up. But here they're just focusing on making it a magnetic field sensor. And what's really amazing about this is, although that sounded like some impossible quantum mechanics, the design and creation of this printed circuit board is entirely open source, and it is not at all outside of the reach of the home gamer. And you would be surprised that nitrogen-doped synthetic diamonds are actually cheap if you buy them in tiny, tiny quantities, which is all you need here. The rest is a green laser and a photodiode and the RF generator to make the microwave pulse that you hit it with. If you look at this sample device here, it's got the diode encased in a piece of epoxy and then a loop of copper around it, and that's about it. You're just reading back how much light you get and at what frequency from the pulsed microwave you get it, and it makes an extraordinarily sensitive magnetic field detector.
Yeah, I was very impressed with this one as well. Although I was wondering, if you live in Quantum Village and you know where it is, you don't really know how fast it's going, right? But sorry, I couldn't resist that one. I wrote about quantum sensors last year, and I think I did another piece on using diamonds for data storage, and they all have this nitrogen vacancy thing going on. And it always occurs to me with that subject, I think what goes on in your body and also the atomic physics, is that I don't know if when I was in school we just didn't know as much or they just didn't tell us, but I would have swore that, diamonds were not as complicated. And yet when you read the scientific papers, they know a weird amount about all this. Well, this molecule is 30 degrees off the center of the lattice, and that's why it has this behavior. And I get the same thing. I'm like, gee, your body, we learned you have white blood cells. But then when you start reading, it's like, oh no, there's these 50,000 things that are going on that they now understand. Or, when I was a kid, they always said, once you split the atom, it's just those pieces, the proton, the neutron, the electron. You're never going to get further down than that. Well, now, we're 5 levels down from there as far as I can tell. So I don't know if those experts just weren't, we just didn't have that kind of information available when I was a kid in school or in college, or if we've just learned a whole heck of a lot in the last, 40 or 50 years. Maybe some of both. It seems like there's a lot of research on these weird diamond things. And like you say, a lot of it's coming up with quantum computing, data storage. And yeah, somehow I'd like to learn more about that, but I don't really have any plans at the moment. So. Have you bought your NV diamonds off of the usual websites, Elliot?
I haven't bought my diamond yet. I'm looking at the bill of materials here, though, and the diamond is like one of the cheaper things. It's a $10 part. Their bill of materials, they come with like 115 pounds, I guess, which is probably approximately dollars. 115 global money units, and so they've got this diamond for $10, and then an ESP32 board also for $10. And I'm like, what kind of crazy world do we live in where the most expensive part of this fancy device, I guess the microwave generator counts, that's legit for that to be an expensive part, but the rest of it it's not very bad at all.
Yeah, but think back, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, a computer with the capabilities of an ESP32 with wireless connectivity would have been, that'd been $500,000 worth of piece of lab equipment as it was. And so my fantasy world is where we get something on the tip line where somebody says, hey, I figured out how to make a quantum computer for $75 in my garage, and we're going to run that, and it's going to change the world. So that's my fantasy sequence of this episode. So, but it could happen. I mean, something like this shows you that it's not like I'm saying I hope somebody invents the warp drive, right? Well, yeah, okay, sure, but something could happen here.
Yeah, and so that's what's really cool about this is it is cutting edge and totally accessible at the same time.
So are you going to open a car repair place near a university called Quantum Mechanics, taking the uncertainty out of car repair?
So many things in life are uncertain, but you always come up with the appropriate bad joke. It's lovely. Lovely.
Yeah. You're not the first person to make that observation. So.
I don't know what state you're in, but we got you excited.
Exactly. There you go. Well, my first pick today is not as cutting edge as yours, Elliot, but it's a little more nostalgic and it's a little cutting edge. It doesn't really have a hacker name associated with it. It's from the National Association of Broadcasters, and they are proposing this system to augment and or replace GPS, which is called the Broadcast Positioning System, BPS. And I say it's nostalgic because basically it's LoRaN, which we've written about before, which is an old technology, except instead of building dedicated LoRaN transmitters, you just basically shoehorn some information into the digital TV transmitters that are everywhere anyway. It's not super GPS replacement because, obviously there's places you don't get TV, and there's certainly lots of places you wouldn't have enough visibility of enough different stations. Certainly out in the middle of the ocean or certain parts of the United States are fairly devoid of TV stations, oddly enough. But if you do have it, it makes a great augmentation, both because if GPS is compromised or disabled, then you've got some sort of backup, but also, digital TV transmitters are generally pretty powerful and they're everywhere. So that means at the, inside my office building, I suddenly have something that's pretty good relative to GPS. The time synchronization was within 100 nanoseconds 95% of the time, which is probably not as good as GPS, but still pretty good. And if you've got 4 towers that you can hear at the same time, you can estimate your position to about 100 meters. Interestingly, if you understand how radio navigation has ever worked, there's absolutely nothing new here, right? The only new parts is how we stuff the data into the stream and that we want everybody to do it. So, that's the reason I say it's not nearly as cutting edge as yours, but I do think it's an interesting use of a resource that we already have. The statistics I read was there's in the U.S., sorry for everybody not in the U.S., but there's 516 VHF stations operating with 10,000 watts and over 2 widely separated bands. So you have a lot of frequency diversity. And then you've got over 1,500 UHF stations running somewhere between 100 kilowatts and a megawatt of power. So lots of power, lots of coverage, and it's kind of a neat idea. The story, that we looked at was basically a slideshow they had presented, but a lot of that detail came from some white papers, and I've got a link down there to where you can find all the white papers. You could spend a week digging through the white papers. The bad news is, bad news last instead of up front, is that right now it's just kind of an experimental thing, and there's 6 stations that are broadcasting this data. So basically, there's just a little area that you could actually use this on today. And I think there's some competing standards out there to do similar things, but I just thought it was a really interesting thing. Reminded me so much of Loran, and it's just everything old is new again, I guess.
Yeah, right? I was thinking about this and like, why would you want to do it? Maybe one thing is GPS jamming, but that's just because my mind is in apocalyptic mode these days. But then we were talking about it offline, and you mentioned that, sometimes GPS has real trouble inside houses and stuff. And of course, everybody gets TV signals fairly well inside their house. I mean, that's kind of the point of them. They just penetrate through everything. And so that part's interesting. It kind of falls down for indoor uses, though, for me, when the resolution's down to like 100 meters. Like, that's not going to help me find out where something is in my living room at that resolution, I think. Although I wonder if, having more density of transmitters would help with that.
I think 100 meters might get you something like in an office building or a warehouse.
Yeah.
Or a big factory floor. I mean, you're right. It's not gonna, make your Roomba miss the sofa.
Right.
And you would think this might get better over time too, right? I mean, this is very early days for this. You're right. If GPS gets jammed or denied, that's one thing. But I think the real worry is when you spoof GPS, right? Because if you've got something, say, I don't know, a self-driving car, and it's suddenly off by a quarter of a mile, then, your robo-taxi runs off a bridge or something. So having some alternate way of saying, oh, look, I think I'm here, and this also thinks I'm here, and this third thing thinks I'm here, so I'm probably here, right? Whereas if I get a disagreement, I can do something, right? Go safe, or get rid of the one that's way off, or fuse all 3 of them into, Kalman filter or something. And I think there's a lot of benefit to having both time and position in multiple forms so that you just can't get totally confused for a lot of applications.
Well, coming up from me, a video by Thought Bomb Design, Space Mouse Destroyed for Science. And this is actually a little bit of an old video. I've seen this one before because I'm a total Space Mouse fanboy. I'll admit it straight up. I actually bought a bunch of them used on eBay, the like super old serial ones. So they're really fantastic. If you don't know what space mice are, they are 6 degree of freedom controllers. You can bend it, push it up and down. You can turn it in 3 different axes. You can push it around in 3 different directions. And they are on springs and kind of, floating basically, and you just move it around. If you're a modern person and you think, how are these things made? You might come up with all sorts of crazy ideas, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But the reality of how a modern space mouse is made is incredibly simple. And if you watch this video, you can actually see it. And I think, seeing him take this apart is actually incredibly enlightening. But I'll tell you the secret. It's that it's got 6 LEDs and it's got 6 light sensors. And then it's got 3 pillars that block the light but have slits in them. And one of the slits runs horizontally and one of them runs vertically. And so you can tell when the light is getting dimmer or brighter on all 6 of these sensors. And that is the whole thing. It's connected internally by a couple springs, so it's got a natural neutral position, and they're like self-calibrating and stuff like that. It's a shockingly simple construction, and the one he goes through in this video is a much newer version, and it's built like a hacker built it. It's built with PCBs that are held together by slots with other PCBs that go through them and soldered in there. The springs are soldered into through holes in the PCB. It's totally something you could make yourself. But what I just love about this is how elegant a solution this is. And when I talk about, the crazy ways I would make one now, the first thing you think of is maybe an accelerometer or something. And indeed, we've seen people make them out of accelerometers or an IMU or an accelerometer with a rotary encoder. I'll throw links in the show notes. Another way you could do it is, if you're feeling super fancy, there are these awesome 3D Hall effect sensors. And so you could, put a magnet on your device and use the 3D Hall effect sensor to sense its position and stuff. Like there's all sorts of hyper fancy ways you can do it, but this thing is really 3 plastic interrupters with slits in them and 6 LEDs and 6 photodiodes.
Yeah, they're interesting devices, and if you haven't run into them, what you maybe haven't mentioned, Elliot, is that bought brand new, they're fiendishly expensive, right?
Right. Yeah.
They are not, they're not the $30 mouse from Walmart. We had a bunch of them at a place I used to work, and we paid a huge amount of money for them. They're great. I've always wanted to see, because there are so many designs. If you go to like Thingiverse or Printables, I don't know why I couldn't remember that. But if you go to one of those sites, there's about 20 designs out there for things that are, the 3D space mouse replacements. Some of them work differently, like you say, but I wish somebody who was really adept at these would like build all of them and say, here's a real space mouse, here's all the other ones. This is the one you should build because blank, right? And I don't know what the answer to that. That'd actually be a good article for us to do, honestly. I don't know what the different pros and cons are. I always think if I were doing it, I'd probably take 3 time-of-flight sensors in a box and you stick your hand in the box. And the only problem is you got to have a way to take your hand out of the box, right? I don't know.
Right.
have to have a foot pedal, right? Put your hand in the box, press the foot pedal, move your hand around, then let go of the foot pedal. It'd be like driving a standard car, right? Just to push the clutch in before you stick your hand in the box. And then you could call it the Jom Gabar mouse or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Right? So, but yeah, I think there's probably a lot of different ways to do that. And I think that's what I'd be curious about. I wish we could grab somebody who designed these and say, did you really come up with that and say that was the best way of the 12 ways we thought of to do it? Or was it just the first way you thought to do it? I don't know. You got to wonder what their rationale for picking that way as opposed to other ways were. And is it really better? And by what dimension is it better? I mean, is it, it might be everything else is just as good, but this is cheaper to make or more maintainable or more protectable by patents. I mean, there's not better doesn't always mean to the suits what it means to us, right? So
they are super expensive if you buy them new. I actually really like the old ones. Pick yourself up an old Magellan brand space mouse. These were the ones that were actually designed by the German version of NASA, DLR, for use on controlling multi-degree of freedom robots. And these were actually famously used to manipulate the Canadarm? I don't even know how to pronounce that on the space shuttle. They had this long arm thing that could manipulate things in the cargo bay.
We always said Canada arm because it was from Canada, but maybe, I don't know if they really say it that way or not, but that's what we always said.
And you had to drive the Canadarm with 2 of these things because it had more than 6 degrees of freedom. And I, having driven one around, I use it for CAD basically all the time because it's awesome to be able to maneuver and manipulate your 3D models so easily. Like, it's a super cool device to have. But the idea of trying to manipulate one of these crazy super many degrees of freedom robot arms with them would be a really cool training task. And I think somebody should make like a video game based on that or something. They take a while to get used to using because it's not just up, down, left, right, forward, backward. It's that plus all the rotations and getting your coordination set. Especially I use it on my left hand so that you can do that, so you can zoom in while rotating the thing while spinning it on this one axis is pretty fun. But if you're in the market, definitely look into a used serial one because nobody uses serial peripherals anymore. All you have to do is get a serial to USB converter, and there are drivers for them for every operating system out there. SpaceNav D works well for Linux.
So I just did a quick Google. Actually, the compact ones are running about $160, which is not terrible, but they go all the way up from there, right? I mean, here's one for, I don't know, $1,000 or something. I don't know what's the difference between that one and the rest of them.
Yeah.
Although if you do that search, there's also a cute little print of a mouse in a space station or something. So that's the space mouse. And that goes for $193. So I'm really impressed with that also. So
the old ones are also chunky. Like, it's heavy. It's got a metal base. It's not going anywhere. It is not the small version. But that's actually great. That's actually exactly what you need. Definitely Magellan Space Mouse. There was a super crazy one. If you want to really geek out, go look up the Space Orb, or Space Mouse 3000 Space Orb. It was a futuristic ball-shaped one that was just floating in this, like, I don't know what style it is. It's very artistic. You need to go look at one. Yeah, I'll have to go get you my gallery of weird space mice.
That sounds like a post to me.
It probably should be. I probably should do it. My life with the weird space mice.
Lost in Space Mouse. Yeah, there you go.
Ooh, good.
Well, I have another one without a specific hacker name attached to it, but it's from MIT. They've been building very strange robots, and we kind of check in on them every once in a while. The title's Tiny Pogo Robot Gets Wings, Does Flips, and it looks like a dragonfly. I mean, and you say, oh, you mean like a, sort of like a, no, it really looks like a dragonfly. I mean, or a dragonfly a kid made with pipe cleaner. That might be what it really looks like. The wings don't actually fly like a dragonfly, though. They just provide lift, and it kind of takes it up off the ground because it's so light, I guess, and lets it move and hop. So it can do all sorts of things, and it doesn't have any motors or anything. The whole thing weighs less than a paperclip, so just a couple of grams. I don't know why I'm always so fascinated with these, because first of all, there's no battery, and that makes it totally impractical because it's got to be tethered. So yeah, you can have your cute little, flying robot, but everything you want a cute little flying robot to do involves it not being at the end of a wire connected to a 24-pound battery, right? So I'm not really sure what the real purpose to all this is. Maybe I suspect we're going to one day have a better source of power for things like this. I don't know. It seems like that would be an Ask Hackaday is, what do you want a tiny flying robot to do? It's not clear what you would really do with this. I mean, it's not going to carry a spy camera because it probably barely lifts itself, right? Although, interestingly enough, the great marketing, they said it can carry 10 times its own weight. Okay.
Yeah.
So it can hoist up that postage stamp and just, when you weigh 2 grams, I don't know if bragging about a lift of 10 times your own weight is really a thing. So I don't know. Not sure why I exactly picked this one other than it just seems interesting. I guess I'd be interested to know what people think they might do with something like this, how you could get around the power problems. What can you take from this to make a real, I mean, for instance, I could see maybe having a larger, heavier robot that also had the little winglets for lift like that, but obviously it couldn't be too heavy or else it's not going to, it's going to be diminishing returns. So I don't know, maybe more just a spur off conversation than, leave something in the comments and tell us what you would do with this. So
I love watching it do its thing, which is crazy. Like, it weighs nothing. It's got a bunch of wings. And I don't think it's even doing its own computation on board. I'm not 100% sure. It looks like it's got those little white balls that they use for computer vision tracking. So my guess is it's also steered, but it's just so crazy. Like, it's such an awesome control problem, and I bet they're having a heck of a lot of fun trying to figure out the dynamics of making this thing work and, just what you can do with it. And so, is this pure research? I think so. I don't think we're at the point where you say, what's this thing going to be good for yet? I think you're just looking at it going, wow, that's one of the crazier methods of locomotion I've ever seen. How cool. And of course, they bring out search and rescue as one of the possible explanations for why you'd build a robot that went like this. Like, that's like, I don't know if you're a fan of weird robots, which I totally am. Search and rescue is always the one they bring out when they've made the weirdest robot. Like, the snake robot that can expand and reconfigure itself, totally search and rescue. The hopping winged robot, search and rescue.
Well, so, okay, I'll play devil's advocate on that. So does that mean, I've got somebody stuck in a safe and I want to throw the robot on a tether through the air system? I don't know, maybe. Could bring them 20 grams of food or whatever. Just wait, we're going to send it 50,000 more times so you'll have dinner. It's like, okay.
I actually think that research for research's sake is awesome, and doing crazy robotics is its own goal and is also awesome. And who knows what they've learned from this, what it's going to eventually be applied to. And I think sometimes, it's a hard sell, right? Because they're in this research lab and they have to justify it and they have to get grant money. So they have to say things like that. But I think at the end of the day, the research is its own goal, and that's just fine by me. Well, my last hack is a retro buildification hack from Nick Bild. Replica of 1880 wireless telephone is all mirrors, no smoke. And this is a kind of modern redo of Alexander Graham Bell's photophone, which didn't turn out to be quite as successful as the phone that talks over wires, and mostly because it relied on transmitting voice over light. It was kind of a simple device. Bell's version of it took sunlight, focused it through a lens at a mirror. You spoke into something that vibrated the diaphragm that the mirror was on, and this deflected the beam of light that was reflected off of it. You'd receive it on the other end, and back in his day, it had this like super fancy parabolic reflector and a little selenium cell in it. And it actually generated enough power to run the speaker that it was driving directly. So it was like no power on the other end. Really cool. And, just really like super basic device, given, that it came out like a few years after the regular old telephone. Nick Bild's build here is a little bit of a spin on this. Instead of using concentrated sunlight, he just uses a red laser pointer. But the rest of it is basically the same. It's got a mirror on a balloon stretched over a cup on the other end. And, a very sensitive photodiode on the one side, which actually beats the heck out of the selenium cell, which has a slower response rate. So he manages to transmit music across his room. Pretty cool. It's a great experiment to do yourself. I was a little surprised that he didn't cut out the middleman and like directly modulate the laser with the audio signal. That's a fun thing to do. And instead of shining it on a photodetector, you can actually shine it straight on a solar cell and get the voltage variation out of that. Throw it maybe through an amplifier and you're good to go. There's a whole bunch of ways of doing this kind of trick these days, and I think that is pretty fun too. A couple people suggested things like fiber optics to make the light path a little bit easier. Absolutely. There's just all sorts of fun things you can play around with in this world. And so I wanted to throw in a couple links to one, a brief history of optical communication, which will give you a whole bunch of ideas. And then Li-Fi, it still isn't a thing. And we wrote this post up back in 2015. Hackaday explains Li-Fi, visible light communications. And I think that's too bad because with the super fast LEDs we've got these days, it should be possible to do high bandwidth broadcast data over your light fixtures in your house. But this article is from back in 2015, and it's still, despite the creation of like a Li-Fi committee and an actual standard, it still has not become a commercially available thing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the photophone. I had to go do a little homework because I remember when I was kind of a kid, it was 1976. I'm not going to confess how old I was in 1976, but Popular Electronics had an article, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, about building a photophone. And it's really a photophone. It didn't use a laser, so that was the first time I ever saw that. And somehow that really stuck in my head. I don't know why, because obviously I didn't build one and wasn't all that interested in it, but it did stick in my head enough that when you mentioned that, I went, oh, I think it's kind of interesting if you realize how much stuff was done back in those days before they had any way to amplify electrical signals, because that was kind of your thing about, this just shaking a diaphragm and that's enough to produce sound. But that's how the old record players worked. That's how the old telephones worked. It was just, electricity moves something, but there's no amplification of it. And that really changes the character of things. So, yeah, that's another case of where they were trying to figure out all the different things you could do. And they kind of had that understanding of how sound was produced and different ways you could make something shake and make a sound. I think it's pretty interesting. Great science project for a kid, right? Is do a string telephone and then do a photophone and compare and contrast. So when your kid gets an A in science, you can send me the thank you note. So.
From my limited experience, I've done it with cadmium photocells, the usual photoresistors, and I've done it with photodiodes, and I've done it with solar cells. And, the frequency response of them all is different. So that would be great part of a science fair project. Well, there's tons of things to do here.
Okay, my wrap up for today is from Gary Boyd. DIY scanning spectrometer is a bright idea. I've worked with a lot of spectrometers over my career, and I'm always fascinated. There's so many ways to do that each have some unique way or, unique reason why you want that. You want an Auger spectrometer, or you want a Sims, or you want, optical spectrometry or whatever, X-ray dispersion. So there's all sorts of nuances on how you do this. This one in particular was very interesting. Normally you see where whatever you're testing emits whatever it's going to emit, and you detect that usually spatially, right, through like a prism. But this is different. It's more like a scanning, which I guess I wasn't really familiar with that one. It's a Zerny-Turner spectrometer. And so essentially it has a single detector and you do the scanning. And so it kind of reminded me, if anybody's familiar with Sims, where, you have a ion mill that's moving charged particles around a U. And depending on the voltage you do, it depends on how heavy the particle has to be to get right around the U. And if it's too heavy, it slams into one side of the U. And if it's too light, it slams into the other side of the U. So at the end of the U, there's a detector, and you go, oh, because I've got the voltage at 10 kV, I know that everything hitting the detector weighs this much. And that's another way to do that, right? So it kind of reminded me of that. This is another one of those things where this would have been hot lab equipment 50 years ago, and now people build them in their garage. And I thought that was really fascinating. It kind of makes me think, between the different types of spectrometers that you can have, how many of us have microscopes and drill presses and lathes and all that? Why don't we see more people with spectrometers? It seems like it's a useful thing to have in the lab. So maybe we'll see a renaissance of those one day.
Well, it seems to be Citizen Science Day here on the Hackaday Podcast, because I have 3 quick hacks. 2 of them are science hacks, and one is just for fun. First one, budget Schlieren imaging setup uses 3D printing to reveal the unseen. This is a sweet build by Iden Wardell Aerospace. Get some really clear Schlieren images, which are, well, they're used in aeronautics a lot to see how pressure waves move through air, but you probably know them from the heat waves that come off of tar in the summer, how it bends the light. So different refractive indexes of the light make it bend differently. If you take a tiny beam and you focus it really well and reflect that off of a mirror through your sample and back at your camera, the differences in the refractive index of the air make different light and dark patterns in the camera. He gets superb images here thanks to a really nice 3D printed mirror holder that he can super finely adjust to target it back at his cell phone camera lens, but he also uses a really nice big reflector mirror that he bought for, he says, not much money on the other end. So pretty sweet setup. Marcus Bindhammer, as always, doing science. This is a YouTube video, an absolute zero of a project. He's calculating the absolute zero temperature, and there's a relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume, and there's a constant in there that is the temperature absolute zero. And so he's basically changing the temperature on it's a piston, but it looks like a syringe, and measuring how far the plunger end of the syringe moves. And he's got a really nice setup to do that very, very accurately. He's got a time of flight sensor to measure the distance to a target he's put on the end of the plunger. And so he heats this thing up, lets it expand, and then measures how far away it is, which then tells him how much volume is inside the plunger. And then he uses this to extrapolate down to the temperature of absolute zero, which he gets at negative 268.8 degrees C, which isn't bad. 273.15 is the right answer. But, for a desktop apparatus, respect. And last up, John Cronin, GK STM32 MCU-based handheld game system. This is a sweet handheld game system that's running a bunch of open source games, including Doom and Command and Conquer and Quake, whole bunch of other kind of 1990s video game knockoffs. What's cool about this, of course, is that, besides running Doom, it's a sweet little build running on a single microcontroller, and it's powerful enough to play some of these old Game Boy, Super Nintendo, and other era computer games on the go. Pretty sweet little device.
Okay, well, I'll start the quick hacks for me off with something a little frivolous from, I don't know, I've got a bunch I can't pronounce this week. Havahia? I don't know. HVHAIA, which may be an acronym. I don't know. It's audio effects applied to text. Totally frivolous, but it's very interesting. He actually creates words on an oscilloscope using an audio signal and then applies different filters to them. So you can watch what a low pass filter does to it or what a wave folder effect does. And some of them are actually kind of really interesting and shed a little light on maybe what some of those effects are doing. Bruno Croce has tracing how the Linux kernel handles the shebang. So the shebang is the, octothorpe or pound sign, if you prefer, exclamation point there at the beginning of a shell script. And if you'd asked me a week ago, do you understand how that works completely? I would have said, why, yes, I do. And then when I read this, I was like, oh, yeah, it turns out I didn't actually understand all the nuance down at the detail level. So kind of like saying, do you understand physics? You go, yeah. And then somebody talks quantum physics and you go, oh, wait, no, sorry. If you ever really like to be very detailed on how stuff like that works inside Linux, that's a must read. And last but not least, our friend Mick Mitzella, in a extraordinary display of how cheap everything's gotten and our various excesses. He needed a custom desoldering pair of tweezers, so he just took two of the cheap USB connected soldering irons, 3D printed a little gripper that holds them together, and he has soldering tweezers. It was kind of nostalgic for me because it reminded me a lot of the little tweezer 3D prints we did for the soldering challenge continuity testers, other than, those were holding wires and his are holding entire soldering irons. So if you like a Rube Goldberg design, that's another one to check out.
Doesn't look like it's a permanent design either, right? So you just have to borrow one from somebody, use it for a while, and then you can give it back.
You're assuming that you don't own 5 soldering irons, Elliot, I think.
I am assuming that. I am assuming a modicum of restraint. Al Williams.
I think a lot of us would be embarrassed to admit how many soldering irons we own, so yeah.
Fair enough. Well, that brings us to our Can't Miss articles. These are long-form pieces written by our fantastic Hackaday writing staff. This week I picked Maya Pasha's Porting Cobol Code and the Trouble with Ditching Domain-Specific Languages. Well, first off, the idea is you've got a bunch of old mainframes running Cobol. Should you have someone come in there and translate them to a modern language so that they're more maintainable? And one of Maya's points here is that if you do that, you have to reinvent and recode all of the infrastructure that a domain-specific language like Cobol brings to the table. And so, for instance, in her particular example, it has like a report writer. It was meant to tabulate things, add them up, make averages, and submit reports to CEOs back in the 1960s or 50s or whenever Cobol's from. If you wanted to redo this code base in JavaScript or whatever, you'd have to rewrite the whole report writer function. And you'd have to handle its table handling and formatting abilities and stuff. And her point is, why would you do that? I guess we were talking about this together, and I use a lot of Fortran code, or at least I used to, because deep down, a lot of linear algebra is done using software libraries that are still written in Fortran, and they just work. They're bug-free. They've been bug-free since the mid-'80s. I don't think you're going to improve on them, so why would you? The other thing is that Maya dog-fooded it here. She's like, if you are saying you want to port this into JavaScript because of ease of maintenance, you also have to show that maintaining it in Cobol is hard and that you couldn't learn Cobol fast enough to make that the easy way out. And so she takes it on herself to fire up GNU Cobol and learn a little bit of Cobol, enough to write what she calls a hello business project. And so she does. And I think that's fantastic. And there are a bunch of things like variables, file IO, procedures are all very strange because this language is ancient, but it's not something that you can't handle at all. And it only took her a few hours, including learning the Cobol she needed to learn to do it, to write her hello world. And I think that's kind of fun too. Like, I don't know. I guess I wonder, do we get too stuck to the programming languages we know? Isn't it good to learn a whole bunch of different programming languages? Of course, if it's your day job, you really have to have mastery of the one that your main code base is in. But say you get a project in another one, how much is it really going to hurt you to break your brain for a little bit and learn this extra language? And I think that's what's fun about this, is that Maya actually did that in order just to write a piece for Hackaday, where her main point is that domain-specific languages bring so much to the table in terms of, just functionality they come with out of the box, that sometimes just learning them might be the path of least resistance.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. Like you, I actually have some Fortran code that still works. And a lot of the reasons for some of this too is regulatory. If I've got some regulatory body that I have to give reports to and they've accepted 25 years ago that my software was correct, I don't want to open that can of worms up to say, oh, we've changed our software. Why don't you come dig through everything and make sure it's still okay? This is a stellar example to me, Cobol being so verbose. It's a stellar example to me of the monkey money effect. If you go to management and say, we don't have enough people, we need 5 more people, they'll go, oh, there's no money for that. There's just no money. But if you go and say, if you give me $10 million, I'll develop something that will allow you to fire everybody and hire monkeys to do the same work, right? Cobol and also IBM's answer to Cobol, which was RPG-2, were kind of related to that. It was like, oh, well, we'll let ordinary people do programming, because when you want to do the paycheck, it's paycheck equals hours times rate, and literally, I'm not saying HXR, I'm saying hours times the word times rate. And here's the problem. It's a tedious thing to have to type if you know what you're talking about. And if you don't know what you're talking about, you still can't write a payroll program, right? The fact that it says hours times rate doesn't enable you to suddenly make smart software. So I think that's part of the problem with that. But I totally agree with you that we should learn lots of languages. I mean, I know, especially from that era, I know lots of languages from that era, some of the more modern ones. I find it annoying. The closer 2 languages are, the more it annoys me, because I have to switch back and forth, right? So going from, say, I don't know, RPG-2 to C is totally no-brainer, because it's totally switching. Whereas going from, say, C to C++ to Python to, these languages that are all kind of really similar is very annoying. It's like, say, switching from American English to British English. It's really hard to keep straight. Whereas switching to Mandarin is totally ridiculous, right? If you know Mandarin, then that's what you're talking. But I really thought that was a good point, though, is sometimes we redo stuff just because we want to redo it. And that's not really a good business case, right? If it's working, if everybody understands what it means, we're in an era now where you can, in fact, get things like GNU Cobol. I mean, that would have been a thing at some point. You would have said, well, our Cobol compiler, we don't own the license for it anymore, and we're emulating this on one piece of IBM hardware that's emulating another piece of IBM hardware that actually runs on our hardware that we have today. Okay, maybe that was a better argument. Yeah. But now, if I could spend an hour porting it over to GNU Fortran or GNU Cobol or, some other widely supported thing, maybe that's the right answer. You don't have to put a coat of paint over everything, right?
And I think one thing that's nice about Cobol, you say it's, reducing it so that monkeys can type it, but let's be honest, that's what a lot of modern software development is about. It's, why do people think type safety is so great? It's because it prevents you from screwing up. Why do people, write anything other than assembler? It's because it's hard, and it's because finding bugs is easier when the language is so easy that a monkey could type it. Right? Like the maintainability, one of the examples from Andrew A in the comments, set taxes equal to base rate multiplied by percentage plus ratio. You know, like you're going to see that and understand what it means. Whereas, I've read people's code where they're like, X times R plus I, and they just don't name any of their variables
But that's cultural. I could make a Cobol variable called X too. You just don't, that's not how it's taught and people don't do it. But yeah.
It is. No, I agree totally. Everybody knows that star is multiplied by, and so you don't really gain that much by like typing that out, right?
And you got to look at the historical context, because nowadays, like I say, you can still write X or Y in Cobol, but in Fortran at that time, you had a 6-character external linkage limit probably, right? So you couldn't say payroll. You had to go or something like that.
Right.
So they thought that was this amazing innovation that you could say payroll instead of and then you've got something.
It is an amazing innovation, though. Like being able to name variables and functions descriptively is huge.
I agree. But I'm just saying, I think in the modern context, it's less clear that is great. Although, it's great arbitrarily, but it was super great at the time. But here's what I mean about monkey money, though. It's not so much that I object to long variable names or anything, far from it. But what I do think is the dream is always, once we get this perfected, we can get rid of all these ornery, high-priced prima donna programmers that we have, and we can just let the normal people do it. And that is not sufficient for letting normal people do it. What you're talking about, the modern take on that is, even though, yes, we do have long variable names, and yes, we have, better debugging and stuff, but really what you see is we keep further abstracting it, right? So just as Cobol and Fortran is an abstraction over assembly, something like Python, where you have huge abstractions over giant libraries that most people, well, I shouldn't say most people, many people writing Python couldn't write if you put a gun to their head, but they can still use it, right? Or the Arduino, great example of that, right? There's all this stuff. You might not know how the SPI protocol works, but you don't care because you put your SPI library in there and then you talk to the SPI device, and you may know how it works, you may not. It doesn't matter anymore. That turned out to be, I think, the answer. Cobol's answer was just make it read like English and people will understand it. RPG2 from IBM, I don't know if you ever saw that or not, their take was all business software can be reduced to fill in a form. So you had different forms. You had your input form, your output form, your calculation form, and they literally sold these sheets that were 80 columns or 96 columns, depending on where you were, that were all coded. So you say, okay, if you want this to be left justified, you put an X right here, right? And if you want it to be, and it literally said left justify X or blank, and you did that.
Oh, cool.
That's great, but at the end of the day, what makes great computer programs is not the language you write them in. It's the logic, the design, the algorithms in some case, but it's all the stuff that we do. And it's not just, if you could just check out the form. It's like saying Beethoven wrote great music, so we'll just look at what he had for breakfast in the morning and feel that, he uses a number 2 pencil, so make sure to have that for breakfast and get a number 2 pencil. That wasn't what made the music great, right?
Anyway, I think Maya is going to gear up to do us a Fortran piece and maybe even a deeper dive into Cobol coming up. So if you are enjoying the ride through nostalgic computer programming languages, just stay buckled in.
My pick this week was Jenny List's Ask Hackaday Vibe Coding. And we've been kind of talking about this movement, if you will, behind the scenes here for a couple of weeks. But I guess one of the OpenAI gurus said, I don't really code anymore. I just kind of chat with the AI and it usually gets a lot of it right. And I guess it just depends on what your goals are. But if you're writing your next handheld game, maybe sort of right is okay. And if you're doing somebody's pacemaker code, maybe sort of all right isn't exactly the same. I loved what Dan Maloney had coined a while back, is that the AIs are like the world's worst summer interns. I really am interested in this because I'm actually a pretty good proponent of a lot of the tools that are coming out now that use LLMs. But I do think we're going to see a kind of oscillation, if you will, of people wanting to use it for everything and then figuring out, well, maybe not everything, and then maybe go too far the other way, then back. So I think we'll kind of have a dampened sine wave until it kind of averages out. We've seen that in a lot of other computing areas too. Object-oriented programming was going to change everything. And then now you go, well, maybe you don't want to use it at all times. We have that conversation a lot. And then there's other things, there's functional programming, there's other things. So you can't just get one size fits all. But I did think it was interesting. And the comments on this one is probably which it's an Ask Hackaday, so that's appropriate. But I think the comments had a lot of good things to say. Part of what makes a good program is not just I got the syntax correct. I've often said this, I don't know how to quantify it, but sometimes you can look at software and you can just say that software smells good. Or conversely, sometimes it doesn't smell good. And that quality doesn't correlate to how well that person knew the language. It's something about the problem solving, creativity, elegance of construction. I don't know. It's hard to say. And I just don't see where using it in that way. And this goes back to the monkey money, right? Everybody's salivating at, we can get rid of all the difficult to get along with social misfit engineers and just ask the AI to do all our work for us. But reality is that may never get here. And certainly, even if one day gets here, it's not here today. I personally have found, I've seen people use this where they go, I want this large program, and it writes it. And of course, it's never right. And so you make changes, you say, well, no, change this, change that. That's a long pull. And I suppose if you can't do it any other way, that's your best option, right? But I think the real value to some of this, quote, vibe programming, unquote, is to just have it do stuff you don't want to do. And it's pretty easy for you to tell. So I've done that before. I'll say I'm not a big Python guy. I write some Python, but not super, super fluent in it. And I'll go, I need to count the number of ones in this, array. And I know I could figure that out, but I got to figure out, how do I do that? So I just go there and say, write me a function that takes an array and counts the number of ones in it or something. And it does that. And you can kind of look at it and go, yeah, that's right. Or, that's crazy. That's never going to work. Or you could write a little unit test and say, yeah, that worked. And so then that takes 5 minutes instead of the 40 minutes it takes me to go remember all the little pieces I have to do that. But ultimately, the structure of my program, the way I solve the problem, what I present to the user, how I process the data, all that's still on me. I don't think the computer's anywhere near in a state to be able to do that very well. And so I'm very concerned that the vibe programming is going to push us into a weird peak in the damped sine wave that is where this becomes normal background noise. Right now, it seems like it's taken over everything. But we see this all the time, right? If you're old enough, multimedia was everything. Well, it's just kind of become normal, right? You don't think of multimedia anymore. It's just everything is multimedia. Networking was like that at one time, right? That was this bizarre specialty. I hired that guy. He knows networking. Well, now that's just what computers do. And conversely, there's things that don't pan out, right? There's some things that you don't remember as well that, that's going to change everything. And then at the end, they just disappear. So I always say successful things either become part of the landscape or they're not successful and they vanish. And so I think that's kind of where this will be. This will turn into a tool people use. It's probably not the tool that people envision they're going to use now, but I think there's really a long way to go to get people thinking correctly about how do you use this tool. So I don't know. And I know you've got differing opinions on that too. I was wondering what you thought of that article, Elliot.
I don't know if I do. I mean, I think that it's super useful to kick off all the boilerplate stuff that you can. And I think sometimes, if that's what you're getting out of vibe coding is, write me the dumb stuff that I just don't want to type, then I think I'm totally okay with that. I'll bring up, though, the Microsoft/Carnegie Mellon joint study that Maya wrote up for us, Why AI Usage May Degrade Human Cognition and Blunt Critical Thinking Skills. Because what a lot of people are starting to find now is that their over-reliance on AI is actually changing their ability to code a little bit. And this kind of gets into a deep topic. The way human brains work is we have a lot of stuff we kind of do on autopilot, right? Like, when you drive a car or ride a bike or whatever, you're kind of, it's a very low effort. You've done this a million times. You're good at this. Your brain can kind of do it without working too hard kind of effort. And this is mode 1 in the psychologist world. And then there's the stuff you have to think freaking hard about, and that's mode 2, and that's where original thinking comes up, and where the hard problem solving. The problem is that the mode 2 thing can only handle so many ideas at once at any given time. And so you kind of rely on the mode 1 brain to have practiced some of these dumb, simple things and internalize them enough that the mode 2 brain can then work with them as if they were individual units, right? This is way too deep into the theory of mind, but this is what comes out of this study, is that by automating some of the really simple tasks, you lose the kind of automaticness and the ability of the kind of automatic part of your brain to chunk these things together into bigger logical units. And that actually affects the way your hard thinking mode 2 brain is able to deal with things. And this is really weird, and it's something that's really new. If you're working for a traditional Japanese master, doing scroll mounting, you have to make the paste for so long that making the paste that you use to glue the scroll together becomes absolutely instinctive to you. And then and only then can you start to attend to the higher level things that really matter. And this kind of mastery where, you go on autopilot for it, I believe probably also happens in coding. And, the when I do these structures, this happens is probably really useful to have under your belt if you're doing coding all the time. So I don't know. It's possible that like autocomplete helps with this, but it's also possible that it hurts. And I don't know where we are yet, but there's growing evidence on both sides.
No, I think it hurts, and I think we've seen it before. The only problem is I think we adapt, right? So, a couple of examples. When I was younger, I traveled all over the country for work, and I would figure out where I was going to go, and I would, work it out and stop and ask people for directions and all that. I got a GPS now. I don't ever do any of that, and I've totally lost it. I'm totally lost at all times. I ask the GPS where I'm going, and it tells me, and that's the end of it. Imagine growing up with GPS. You'd never have the skill of just saying, oh, here I am, I'm going to go do that. I think the other case that we see that a lot is, I'm old enough that when I was in grade school, calculators became widely available, and
right.
they weren't super cheap, but they were cheap enough that people started getting them. Well, that was going to ruin math. It was going to ruin math. Everybody, the kids would just be ignorant and they would never know. But instead, I think that has kind of liberated people to think more about math and not do so much work on math, right? It's not the point to math is to add numbers all the time and get the right answer. It's to understand that this particular set of equations is going to transform this number into that number in this way. And so I'm hopeful as a group, as a society, we'll start educating people more in that way. Is okay, you don't have to do. Think about what you just said earlier about assembly language, right? I would argue that the fact that I know a bunch of assembly languages very well gives me a decided edge when I'm not writing an assembly language. But does that mean that if you don't know assembly language, you should go home and not write code? No. It just means that when things go badly, I may have a slight edge on figuring out what really happened because I actually know what's going on underneath, as do most people listening to this, right? But we're atypical, right? The typical programmer no longer knows assembly. So I'm hopeful we'll get to that. And I'm thinking maybe the way to look at that is the doctors, right? The doctors, you go to school and then you spend a couple of years doing grunt work, kind of like you're making paste, right? But you pick up all this stuff. So you see, oh, there's a guy that came in and he's got this going on and this is what the experienced doctor did. I'll file that away. I remember now. So maybe that's the thing is we need to make sure people aren't using this as a crutch to get through school. And we need to make sure education is set up in a way that teaches you to use this as a tool and not just use it as a crutch, if you will, or the only way to go. I'm hopeful of that. I don't know if I think that may be overly optimistic, but that's my optimistical, is that a word? My optimistic look at it.
I like it. And you were talking about learning it, education and calculators, right? And like there were times in my life when we had to do math tests and I was forbidden to use calculators. And then, you get to college and the stuff isn't about actually doing the numbers anymore. And so, of course you can use calculators. And I think when you're trying to master and internalize the math part of it, maybe the calculators are detrimental. But later, once you've you've kind of acquired that skill and you've automated that in your brain, then it's cool to use a calculator because it's just hella faster. Coding with AI is probably a little bit this way. I know spell checkers are like this for some people too. If it doesn't atrophy, I think there's no real loss to using the calculator or to having the AI type your boilerplate for you. But if you've never learned the skill, if you haven't already acquired the skill and you start that way, I think it's a shortcut that may prevent you from developing patterns in your brain that will later help you think about things. And so like you probably don't need to code any more machine language or assembly language because you've probably coded enough of it that you have those patterns in your head so that when they would help you, they would help you. But if you've never done that, you just don't have those patterns and you can't draw on them. There's a theory about creativity, and I totally believe it, which is that it's just putting together things you've already seen in novel and interesting ways. And so kind of what you've internalized is important for the higher level creative thinking that you can do as well. You know, if you don't have those already established patterns internalized, then that really hinders you later on.
You know, it's kind of a tangent, but I was talking to Patrick, my son. You've met Patrick. I was talking to him this morning, and he was saying, of course, he's very pro AI, as you know, which is fine. And I think I'm pretty pro AI myself, but he makes me look like a detractor. And he said, well, I don't understand. People expect perfection from the AI, but, you don't expect perfection from people. When you go deal with real people that they're not going to always do things perfectly, and you don't just go, that's it, get rid of them, I said, yeah, but the problem is we've been conditioned for years that computers are perfect, right? You don't do a spreadsheet, get a sum of the total and go, oh, I got to double check to make sure that sum is correct because it's probably wrong, right? Or it could be wrong. Short of an Intel bug in the Pentium, it's going to be right. And I think that's kind of the thing is we have a different expectation for computers. And also we have less nonverbal cues. I mean, think about it. If you met two programmers who both told you, I wrote this code, there's certain cues you would get from each one of them. And one you might go, that guy's is probably going to be pretty good. That guy's, maybe we better watch that one pretty carefully, right? But with the computer, it's always 100%. Here it is. I'm completely correct. Yes. And by the way, for decades, things that come off on the same screen as I have are always correct. So of course this is always correct. And of course the problem is it's not always correct. It's a, probabilistic thing, and sometimes it's wrong. And I think that's another case where we got to get a lot more education that people just think, they just take it.
Yeah, it's funny you talk about the believability of it and how AI bluffs so well because, apples to oranges here. It's like I ask Copilot to do it or I go look it up on Stack Overflow. When I go look it up on Stack Overflow, I can judge by the quality of the answers whether I know which one's right, probably fairly well, without even knowing anything about the problem, right? Like the first answer on Stack Overflow is always wrong. The most voted up stands a chance of being right, but not always. And then if you scroll down far enough, you actually always find the right answer. And it's the one that sounds like it's right, and you don't get the same diversity experience and none of the social cues with the AI answers. And so it just gives you the answer, right? And you just get the one answer and you could take it or you can ask it to refine it. And if you don't ask it to refine it, a lot of the time you're in deep doo-doo. And so you have to know that it's wrong and you have to be really critical. And I don't know which is better, but on Stack Overflow, people have reputation. They give you cues by showing that they're knowledgeable about the subject. There's all sorts of kind of human factors that lend to believability of one answer over another. And I find that tremendously useful.
Yeah, and you don't get that. I did notice that Google Gemini has an interesting feature now. And frankly, I hate to say this, Google will probably go punish me for it, but they've been a little bit behind on
They're behind.
It's just not been as good of an experience with them. But one thing I really loved about Gemini, when you get an answer, you say, has a president of the United States ever walked on the moon? And it'll say, no, I don't think so. However, there's a thing at the bottom. You can expand the little menu and you can say, double check this. And it basically pulls out the key things, does a Google search on it, tries to decide if it can find something factual for it. And if it does, it highlights it in green. And if it doesn't, it highlights it in red. And then the neutral stuff is just, well, tough. You're on your own still. But it will actually find stuff where it'll go like, ooh, I looked that up. And it turns out Millard Fillmore did not walk on the moon. I think that's really cool because it does give you another way to cross-check the veracity. I would like to see more of that. And of course, a lot of them give footnotes, but then we've seen cases like the lawyers where it says, well, it's this case, and then they go put that in a court pleading, and then there is no such case. So the footnotes, I think, are a little less reliable, but still a good idea.
If you are Andrei Karpathy is one thing, but vibe coding, if you're my mother-in-law, is something else entirely, because, you know, you have to decide whether it's right or wrong. And none of your normal human skills come to bear. You have to like look at the code it's giving you and say, is this reasonable code? You know, even if you're not concerned, and this is, I think, part of the vibe coding ethos, is you're not concerned with how the code looks. You're just concerned with whether the code works. And so it could be horribly inefficient and crappy and run around 12 ways from Sunday. But as long as it gets you to the right answer, you're stoked because you're just vibing, man. And I think to establish that it just works is already a level of kind of discerningness that maybe you could just code it.
If you need something that's not really very important and this is the only way you know how to do it, okay, sure, you know, but if you're doing serious stuff where people's money is on the line or people's lives are on the line or, you know, self-driving car, you know, banking systems, I always say the best designed thing I encounter every day is the cash dispenser on an ATM because it's always correct, right? You know, I think those kind of things, it's very ridiculous to think that you're going to just say, well, I'll have this AI. Nobody actually fully understands how it works. It'll write the code. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll do some tests on it and it's good. That seems like that's not likely to be a winning strategy. Sorry.
And fortunately, I don't think that's the spirit of vibe coding either. I think vibe coding is just, you know, here I made this Hello World web app or, you know, fun video game. I just wanted to try it out. It's a prototype. I'm going to hand it to my friends.
But I'm worried about the monkey money, Elliot. That's the problem. Is the suits?
I know you're worried that as soon as they figure this out, they're going to want to do it. Yep. Yeah. I hear you.
That's what I'm ringing. That's what I'm here to ring the bell for today. So, rise against the machine.
Well, that wraps it up for this week's Hackaday podcast. Thanks very much for listening. If you want to follow the links, you will find them hackaday.com/podcast. And if you see anything you want us to write up, drop us a line, tips@hackaday.com. And until next week,
keep those hacks coming.
I have no idea. The rest is someone at the door.
All right, that's a good one to end on, I think.
Yeah, I think we're done. Andrei Karpathy. Crap, I'm gonna mess up his name.
That's why I didn't say his name. I guess we should turn the recording off. Let's see.
That's it. Now we're done.